Hey baddies! So in my previous videos, some of you commented asking how to make a sourdough starter. So here's my easy method for making a starter completely from scratch. And this recipe makes a smaller size starter because I don't like to waste too much flour on feeding and discarding. And it might take you longer than 6 days for your starter to be ready, which is completely normal depending on your environment and the type of flour that you're using. I'll also leave detailed instructions in the description box below, so be sure to check that out, as well as my other video on how to maintain a low waste and low effort feeding schedule for your sourdough starter. So, let's get started. First, there's some prep that you need to do before making your starter. You're going to need a clean jar with clear straight sides and a lid. Mine's made of glass and it's about 4 inches tall and 2.5 inches wide for reference. Next, you want to take out a scale and weigh your jar with the lid off. Be sure to write down the weight somewhere where you'll remember, as this will make feeding and discarding your starter much easier later on. Next, you want to prep your flour. I feed my starter with a 50-50 blend of whole wheat flour and unbleached white bread flour. This blend of flours has given me the best results, but you can definitely use unbleached all-purpose flour instead of bread flour. I like to pre-mix the two flours and store them in a container so that I don't have to take out 2 separate bags of flour every single time I feed my starter. Finally, it's time to explain feeding ratios. When first making your starter, we're going to use the feeding ratio of 1:1:1 most often. This represents 1 part starter to 1 part flour to 1 part water. For example, if you had 15 grams of starter, you would feed it 15 grams of flour and 15 grams of water. So if we were to switch it up and feed our starter at a 1:2 ratio, for example, that represents 1 part starter to 2 parts flour to 2 parts water. So 15 grams of starter would be fed with 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water. Whereas a healthy starter fed at a 1:1:1 ratio would take about 4 to 5 hours to rise. A starter at a 1:2 ratio would take about 6 hours to rise. So with time, you're probably going to use many different feeding ratios depending on your recipes and your time schedule, but I just wanted to explain the basics of these ratios first. Okay, now that all the prep is done, it's time for the first feeding. It's 8 a.m. on day 1 of our sourdough starter journey. We obviously don't have any existing starter yet, so our feeding ratio is 1:1, which means we'll be mixing 15 grams of flour with 15 grams of water. In a clean jar, I'm measuring out 15 grams of our pre-mixed flour blend with 15 grams of water and mixing it well. I'm just using tap water here, but if the water in your area is heavily chlorinated, or if you just want to be extra cautious, then you can use bottled water or filtered water. Use your spoon to flatten the top of the starter and scrape down the sides of the jar to clean it. Then use an erasable marker or a rubber band to mark the side of the jar at the top of the starter so you can easily monitor the growth. And that's it for day 1. Moving on to day 2, I'm going to feed my starter 24 hours later at 8 a.m. I'm going to feed it at a ratio of 2:1:1, which represents the 30 grams of starter I already have in the jar from yesterday's feeding, fed with 15 grams of flour and 15 grams of water. Here's what our starter looks like on the morning of day 2. Obviously no growth yet, but you can see some little bubbles around the side. Same as yesterday, just add the flour and water to the jar and mix it well to combine. We're not discarding anything yet because it's still early and we don't want to thin out the bacteria or the yeast culture just yet. It's important to keep a consistent schedule when making your starter for the first time, so be sure to pick a feeding time that you can maintain. Again, scrape down the inside of the jar to clean it and mark the side of the jar to monitor the growth. I just wanted to show you what my starter looks like at 7:30 p.m. on day 2. It's got this large explosion of growth, but that does not mean it's ready just yet. This just means that there's a burst of bacterial activity, which is really common in the early days of making your starter. Here's our feeding schedule for day 3. This time we're feeding at a 1:1:1 ratio. Here's what the starter looks like in the morning. As you can see, it's fallen significantly overnight. You want to discard the old starter until there's only 15 grams of starter left in the jar. So take the weight of the empty jar that you measured in the beginning, add 15 to that amount, and that's what your scale should read once you're done discarding. Then feed it with another 15 grams of flour and 15 grams of water. Here's the feeding schedule for day 4. It's exactly the same as from day 3. Our starter hasn't grown much since the previous day, but don't worry, this is perfectly normal, just keep feeding it as usual. Here's the feeding schedule for day 5. From now on, rather than feeding it just once a day, we're going to feed our starter twice a day, 12 hours apart. Here's what the starter looks like in the morning of day 5. Since the previous morning, it rose and nearly doubled and then deflated again. There are some small bubbles too, which is a good sign that our starter is showing some activity. So here's the first feeding, same as what we've been doing for the past few days now. This is the starter at 12:30 p.m. I was really excited to see this because it's more than doubled in size after just 4.5 hours, which is a very promising sign that our starter is almost ready to use. So from this point on, I'm going to watch my starter very carefully and note how long it takes to rise after feeding. If it continues to grow this way in a similar pattern, then I'll know my starter is ready. Here's my starter again at 7:30 p.m., just before the next feeding. As expected, it's fallen slightly, which is a sign that the yeasts have run out of sugars to consume in the flour and have stopped producing gas. This means that they're hungry and it's a good time to feed the starter again. It's now 8 p.m. on day 5. It's time for the second feeding of the day, and I'll leave it to rise overnight. Here's the feeding schedule for day 6. My starter was ready to use after the first feeding at 8 a.m., but I'll talk more on how to know when it's ready and how to maintain your starter later on in the video. But first, here's my starter on the morning of day 6. I wasn't able to film my starter after feeding it the night before, but just before I went to bed at around midnight, the starter had doubled in size again. That was the second time in a row that it doubled in 4 hours, meaning that it's very nearly ready to use. So I'm feeding my starter again at a 1:1:1 ratio, and like I mentioned before, we're looking for our starter to continue to rise in a predictable pattern so that we know it's developed a strong enough yeast culture and is ready to use. Here's my starter at 12:30 p.m. As you can see, it's doubled in size again after 4.5 hours. It's clearly displayed a predictable rise pattern, so that means it's finally ready to use. And that's the key point to remember. Your starter is ready only after it's able to double in size within 4 to 5 hours when fed at a 1:1:1 ratio at least 3 times in a row. To prove my point, I'm going to do a float test, where if you drop a small piece of starter into some water and it floats, that means your starter is ready. Of course, the float test isn't always reliable and can give false positives, so seeing a predictable rise pattern in your starter is a much more reliable method. If your starter hasn't risen in a predictable pattern by day 6, that's okay. Simply continue the twice-a-day feeding schedule from day 5 until it does. To maintain your starter from now on, I suggest feeding it twice a day, 12 hours apart, at a 1:2:2 ratio for at least 5 more days. At that point, your starter will have stabilized. So if you don't want to continue keeping it at room temperature and feeding it multiple times a day, I made a video on how I keep a low maintenance feeding schedule by storing my starter in the fridge. I'll link it in the description. So that's how to make your own sourdough starter from scratch. I hope it was easy enough to follow, but please leave your questions in the comments if you have any. I also have detailed instructions in the description box below. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.